So, welcome everybody to this episode of Changing Minds. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and I'm delighted today to be joined by two wonderful guests who are the authors of a brand new book, Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain. Now, if that title sounds intriguing to you, well, the book will be even more so. In it, the authors, Douglas Kenrick and Dave Lundberg-Kenrick, have worked together on a wonderful model, a 7 motives model of some of the lessons we can learn from our ancient ancestors. Just to give you a little bit of background about Douglas and about Dave, I just want to sort of go through their bios really briefly, and then we'll get into the book because I have lots of questions for both of them. First of all, Douglas Kenrick is President's Professor of Psychology who has published over 230 books and articles, many applying his ideas from evolutionary biology and anthropology to understanding social psychology, which of course is a big passion here at Changing Minds. His research has been funded by the NSF and NIMH. He's published in top scientific journals and covered in media outlets, including the New York Times and lots of BBC documentaries as well. He's also written for the New York Times, Scientific America, Fortune, and Psychology Today. And he received the Lifetime Career Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution from the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. And then Dave Lundberg-Kenrick, he has a background in both film production and psychology, and is the media outreach program manager for ASU's Psych for Life program, where he films psychological experts addressing the questions of how research can inform us about living more fulfilling lives. He's filmed a number of documentaries and is co-host of the Zombified podcast. And along with Steve Newberg and the wonderful legend himself, Mr. Robert Cialdini, he is co-author of Social Psychology, Goals and Interaction. So, gentlemen, so honored and delighted to meet you here today. We obviously have a mutual contact who's your friend, Robert Cialdini, Bob Cialdini, a legend in the area of psychology. And I guess just to start out with, just in reading Solving Modern Problems with a Stone Age Brain, as an area of great interest to me in terms of social psychology and also storytelling from your perspective, Dave. I've studied screenwriting and written, a bunch of short films and whatnot. I really found what I loved about it is it's a very simple model, but it's very much based upon a lot of the areas of insight we've had to the modern day. So one of those obviously is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Before I get into that and before we go through the 7 different motives and all that, I want to start out with some general overarching questions that I'm sure you've been asked before. And that is, one of the things you both mention in the book is it's terrible advice to tell people to just act naturally. Now, I have friends that would have said when I was single, before I go on a date, do not act like yourself. Right. So I've heard that advice before. But what is the purpose of why should we not act naturally? So I'd love to start there.
Well, do you want to talk about the naturalistic fallacy, Dad?
Sure. So, and I think it doesn't apply to not acting naturally on a date. It basically, some of our, ancestral motivations are spot on in the current world, but others of those are completely are mismatched to the current world. And so we need to distinguish, when we can act naturally and when not, and so I think that's bad advice to not act naturally on a date, but, to not be your natural self. But there are certain kinds of things, if we have a natural inclination to be selfish or to get angry at people, who don't agree with us, it's good to understand what are the roots of those. We have mechanisms in our brain, for anger and lust, and sometimes they serve us well and sometimes they don't serve us. So the naturalistic fallacy is this: it's an idea that people have been talking about ever since the idea of sociobiology came up, applying an evolutionary model to human beings in a serious way. It's been around since William McDougall in around 1900, but the work got serious in the 1970s. People started to really seriously go back and think, okay, what do we know about animals and how can we apply that to humans? And so one of the things that made people very afraid is, well, so you're going to tell me if I find something that's characteristic, species specific of humans, for example, most mammalian males are more violent and aggressive in their competitions than most mammalian females. And there's a biological reason for that, okay? Differential parental investment. The females invest less, invest more in the offspring. The males have to be chosen, have to say, pick me, okay? And so that's something natural, but it doesn't mean that it's good, okay? And, as a, as a parallel, you can think about, here's some things in nature. Parasitic wasps, they basically sting a caterpillar, paralyze it, lay their eggs inside, and then the larvae eat their way out of this, big, luscious tasting caterpillar. We wouldn't call that a nice thing by any means, but it is natural. The AIDS virus is natural. COVID-19 is natural. So there are plenty of things in nature, where one organism's interest doesn't, jive with another organism's interest. And so with human beings, a lot of times, if we're living in a society, in a modern world in which not everybody is our kinsman, some of the mechanisms we inherited from the ancestral world, although completely natural, the tendency to be afraid of strangers and to be prejudiced, for example, is natural, but we wouldn't call it good. Okay. And so that, I think, that's kind of the key idea there.
Yeah. And I also think, going back to the sort of idea of the date, right, where you're going out on a date and you're trying to figure out how to act. One of the things we talk about in our book, we've got these seven motives. We've got like survival, self-protection, friendship, status, finding a mate, keeping a mate, and taking care of kin and loved ones. And one of the things that I think is really key to life is there's often trade-offs for these sorts of things, right? So if you go out on this date and you see this person and you're immediately talking about how hot they are because that's your natural instinct, and then you get the food and you're eating it with your hands and you throw it at some other guy because you think he might be a threat, right? You're going to be costing a lot of, now this is probably not this is not necessarily you being yourself, right? But this is you just allowing your natural impulses to take over. And this was someone that you're on a date with that is like friends with your friends. There's a decent chance they're going to go back and say, why did you set me up with this person who just was acting, out of control the whole date? And so then you're going to take a hit to, things like friendship. You might take a hit to status. And even in more subtle sort of ways with our life decisions, sometimes we have to weigh these different motives against each other.
So with that in mind, and again, I want to go into the seven different motives that you mentioned. One of the things that obviously is one of the cornerstones of the framework and indeed the book is that obviously we're living in a very different society than we evolved in, and we're still evolving, right? But we evolved. We spent a long time in a specific type of society which optimized particular behaviors, particular instincts, particular needs. And nowadays we're in a vastly different society, but there are some things. It's like you'd mentioned, Douglas, at the beginning. There's certain things that do work really well and do serve us, which is a lot of the stuff that you both mentioned throughout the book, and then certain ways that it's different. One of the other ways that you explain that it's different, we're living in a different world, is the world is more crowded than ever, and yet we still feel alone. Right now, at a surface level, most people will say, "Oh, well, it's technology. Oh, well, it's social media. Oh, well, there's more distance because we are now disconnected from people." But one of the things that you both sort of go into when you talk about modern technology is the parasitic impact that technology can have. Could you talk a little bit about that conflict between our evolutionary history and the desires we had then, and the way the modern world works, and how these technological parasites, as you mention them, have contributed to a negative impact upon our ability to relate to others?
So Dave, Dave, you have an interesting qualification upon this kind of parasitism idea that I think it's worth mentioning before we go into it, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that is so fascinating about the modern world is that we've created this technology that sort of has its own selective pressures, right? And apps and blog posts and things like this, they can essentially live or die based on whether or not they get our attention. And so these sorts of things, news articles, tweets, have in essence evolved to just get our attention no matter what, right? And so it turns out that a lot of times what helps them survive isn't really what helps us. And so, so there's always the classic quote from newspapers, if it bleeds, it leads. And I think that in the modern world of these sort of, there's these like ways that technology have to monopolize our attention in these short bursts, that's gotten really extreme, right? And so we will get these news stories that are terrifying or salacious or whatever they can be to grab our immediate attention, and it can actually give us kind of a warped view of the world. And it can also take us away from things like real life friendship, and which there's a lot of research showing is still good for us in a lot of ways.
So yeah, and I think part of the subtext of Dave's point is that it isn't like there's some evil person behind the media who's plotting. It's just that in some sense we're the perpetrators as well, because we're the ones. I'm the one who clicks on those scary newspaper stories and rewards the New York Times for looking more like the New York Daily News used to in the 1950s. Okay, I don't know. Are you living in New York? Is there still a Daily News, and is it still?
Yeah, to be honest, I try to avoid the news for exactly the reasons that both of you explained.
Right. Okay. But anyway, so it isn't like there's some evil monster there. It's just basically we have a set of powerful, evolved motivations. Okay, and whenever there's a powerful motive, there's an incentive for parasitism, and parasitism isn't always a bad thing. There's a continuum of parasites. Parasitism means that basically one organism basically gets some energy from another organism, and sometimes it's cooperative. Sometimes, like with the clownfish and the sea anemone, they both get something out of the relationship. Okay, the sea anemone gets cleaned, the clownfish gets protected. Okay, so that's the first level of, I think, I forget the term for that. Maybe that's called let's call it cooperative relationships. No, it isn't commensal. Then there's something called commensalism, which is like a pilot fish that swims along with a shark, and it gets some of the scraps of the shark's meal. It doesn't really take anything from the shark, but it is benefiting. It's getting energy from hanging around the shark, and the remora actually hangs on the shark, but it's a very small cost. Then you move to microparasitism, things like mosquitoes. Take a little teeny bit of our blood, not even enough for us to avoid going out, because that's just a teeny bit. And then there's giant parasites that basically, basically can sap the life's blood out of an organism. There's one kind of a parasite that I think it works with crabs, and it actually it latches onto their genitalia, and consumes their genitalia, and then the crab continues to eat and feed this creature that's completely stopping its reproductive. So there's those kinds of things out there. Some of the parasitism is malicious. It's like those nasty creatures with the crabs. Some of it is just cooperative. The media is giving us something we want. And when you look at, so let's go back to our pyramid and sort of lay it out a little bit more. What we're sort of arguing in the pyramid, and it's based originally on Maslow, is there's these developmental motives that unfold in human beings. When you're a baby, all you care about is getting milk and keeping dry and warm. Okay. Now that never goes away. We always want to eat, and we always want, so our pyramid doesn't, it has sort of overlapping triangles. Rather than one going away, the other one recedes into the background as you move up to the next level. So protecting yourself against strangers. When kids get to be, when they're mobile, they start to become afraid of strangers. Why? Because strangers may have been dangerous in the ancestral past, okay? But we still have that. Kids are afraid of strangers today. And we continue as adults to be afraid of strangers a little bit, and to be wary of dangerous people. We're especially worried, for example, of young males, because they were the ones that came over the hill to loot the village and rape the women. Then we move up to affiliation. And when kids get to be preschool age, they start to care about making friends, okay? But they don't necessarily care about getting respect. I've watched this in Dave's younger brother, who at first he didn't care. First, he didn't really care about even making friends. Then he went to preschool. He got interested in friends, but he didn't care what they thought of him. And then at some point, maybe, around the first grade, he started to really want a little bit of respect from these other kids. And again, these things continue. Then when you reach puberty, you start to become interested in mating possibilities, and I remember I like to tease Dave about this, and he says he thinks I made this up, but it's like when we were driving along the coast of California when he was about 12 years old, and a surfing song comes on that says, "Two girls for every boy," and Dave said, "Yuck," and I said, "Just hold on a couple of years, kid. You might change your opinion about that." And it did change, in fact. But so then you become concerned with finding a mate. And then after you've found a mate, you become concerned with keeping a mate. You don't have to worry about keeping a mate until you've got one, okay? And as some of us have learned, maybe all three of us in this room, finding a mate and keeping a mate are two different problems. And you can sometimes be okay at one, and the next level is a little harder to reach. And then finally, from an evolutionary perspective, that's all leading towards parenting, okay? Taking care of the offspring. Humans are a species in which the males and females bond. That's actually not true of 95% of other mammals. 95% of mammals are sort of one night stand, like Los Angeles in 1973, okay? Just, hit and run. But humans, in every society throughout history, the males have stayed around and helped take care of the offspring. And so that our pyramid basically looks like that. It's different from Maslow's because Maslow didn't have any of the mating motives. And he was kind of an early evolutionary psychologist, but before people began to think about the fact that the essence of evolution is basically differential reproduction. And so a lot of people, we had that article came out and got in the New York Times, and there were a bunch of nasty letters to the New York Times, and there were nasty letters to the dean of ASU saying, how dare these people mess with Maslow's sacred pyramid, because people had come to think of self-actualization as this ideal you should aspire towards. And we're not saying people don't, Maslow's examples were playing music if you're a musician, doing art if you're an artist, okay, writing poetry if you're a poet. And the place where we disagree with Maslow is not that people love doing those things, but that they're not non-social motives. In fact, why did Diego Rivera paint? Well, he wasn't the world's handsomest guy, but he would not have gotten Frida Kahlo and lots of other beautiful women if it hadn't been for his talent. So we believe that, in fact, the drive to develop your own potential is actually linked to social motives, to getting respect and to eventually finding mates.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because again, that would be, look, I look at your model here and I see, look, you start with the similar start with Maslow and the physiological needs, right? Then going up to protecting yourself, making sure you're safe. Then it comes up to building affiliation and friendships. Then it goes up to status and esteem, and then it goes up to finding a mate, keeping a mate, parenting. And I think that's solid. And I think I've heard you mention before, just because they tend to go in that sequence from a developmental perspective doesn't mean that at certain points, if you lose everything, then maybe you get to a stage where you're really in trouble. Your physiological needs actually take precedent. Or if something happens, maybe status needs, even if you're like, you're already a parent, you're back to status again, and you can swap and jump into these different prisms over time. But with regards to what you've just said there, like there's an experience of like, whether you call it self-actualization, whether you call it the flow state by Csikszentmihalyi, whether you call it, in the zone. Like whenever I'm doing something, I suppose maybe it's to do with status. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm just not aware of it, but it feels distinctively different. There's something about being completely in that and doing something that you love and that you're good at, even if no one else is around, even if no one else is nearby, and even if it's not something, quite frankly, that, let's say is going to make you more attractive. Like there's certain things like chess is not something that, you go into a bar and you go, well, actually, I'm a grandmaster in chess. And the girl goes, Really? Oh my goodness. I'm not saying there's not girls out there like that. I'm just saying,
Oh, it's
you
worked
know,
for me. I don't know.
well, there you go. There you go.
I mean, it's chess, yeah, because I was going to ask specifically what those things are, right? Chess is totally a status thing, I think, right? For like,
intelligence type. Yeah, I
yeah.
get it.
And so I do think there are things, well, a lot of times building skills, right, is a thing that doesn't necessarily have an immediate payoff to one of these 7 motives, but it puts you in a position to eventually have payoffs, right? And that's, I think, part of what, I mean, I know when I play chess a lot and far from a grandmaster, but I like the process of learning those sorts of things, right? And so, but I also do like to then, there is a part of my mind which is like, aha, now that I know the whatever, the accelerated dragon, I can finally defeat my dad when we play chess. So I think a lot
got passed a long time ago.
But I think there is I think one of the points we sort of make in this book is that a lot of the things that we do, and it's not to discourage people by any means from being in these flow states, but to sort of think about what is the way that I'm going to bring this back, almost like in the hero's journey with like Joseph Campbell, where it's like you always, after you defeat the dragon and you go off and have your adventure, in the very end, you come back to your family or your tribe or whoever, and you share this knowledge with them. And so
there was one thing that you mentioned there, just in terms of the dragons that we all face, and I'd love to hear both of your philosophies on it. It's a little outside it, but it's directly connected. I often feel that we do tend to pursue challenge quite a lot. Like we pursue problems. If I know myself personally, I sometimes think I'm a lot happier when when I'm an underdog, when the shit hits the fan, when I'm in a difficult spot, than I am when everything is going rosy, when I've got all that I want. Because, again, it's the whole thing. I've got so much to lose. Again, from a Stone Age perspective, my thoughts are initially that it's like, well, that's what we were, hunter-gatherers. You're constantly on the hunt, and that's where the dopaminergic system, sort of evolved to keep us after what we need. In order to survive, we need to go out and get it. And so dopamine, gets us to do that. Adrenaline or epinephrine gets us to be able to have enough energy and alertness to be able to stay safe when we need to run, to hide, to fight, whatnot. But these chemicals evolved to be able to get us primarily directed towards action. So is there something to be said for us seeking out challenges and pushing ourselves? And if so, I suppose, would you still relate that back to sometimes the challenge is to become better so that you will, improve in status. Sometimes it's so that you will get a mate. Sometimes it's so you will make more friends. Sometimes, is that how you would see it? Or how would you explain this desire? I feel that at least I have of wanting to keep making things hard for myself.
So can I make a little qualification on what we're talking about here now, which is that when we talk about these motivations, we actually don't presume that they are necessarily conscious. I mean, so because we're talking about biological influences on behavior, and sometimes when they work, behind the scenes, we're not, I'm not aware of why my heart is pumping right now. I'm not aware of dopamine, working between the synapses in my brain. It's all just happening in the background. And a lot of what happens in nature, including humans' responses to things, it's not that we're consciously thinking, okay, I'm going to increase my reproductive fitness by doing X, Y, or Z, or if I do this, it'll lead to it. Yeah, like a good analogy, I think, is when birds migrate, birds, migrate from the ones that in North America, at least, they come up from South America, in the spring, they hang around in North America, and then they fly back. And when they do that, they're doing it in response to apparently the positions of the stars and the length of the days. Okay. But they're not thinking, oh gosh, the day is short. I better fly back to Mexico now. There's a little mechanism in their brain that switches on, and they don't need to think about it. There's no, there's absolutely no, necessity. And I think a lot of the things that we do it when little boys play fight with one another. They're not thinking, I'm play fighting now, so that I can get higher status amongst my peers and therefore increase my odds of finding a mate, which will improve my reproductive fitness. All that stuff, that song is playing in the background. Okay. It's not usually conscious. In fact, that's why I think people get, when we say, gee, that self-actualization is connected to social motives, we don't mean that it's consciously connected to social motives at all. Okay. It's just that it serves some good for you, and it would have ancestrally. That's all. Okay. And so I don't think one ever needs to. Intellectuals who, you've got a lot of books. I want to mention one of the books on your shelf in a minute, but those of us who read books, we like to think about these things, but the average human being plays out their life without thinking. They may never think of increasing their reproductive fitness or getting their genes into future generations.
Just to tie this back a little bit to this idea of challenges, right? Because Owen, you'd asked about seeking out challenges. I think to break down a very simple algorithm that would have benefited our ancestors is you wake up in the morning and you just say, how can I improve my current situation, right? You don't necessarily even assess too much how good you might assess a little bit because it takes calories to improve things. But if you wake up with, you just think, how can things be better, right? And so sometimes I think when we look around and we've got food, we've got these sort of we call them all fundamental motives, but those sort of motives that we have at the bottom of our pyramid sort of covered,
physiological needs,
right? The basic fit. Then we might think, well, I've got energy, and so what can I do with it, right? And so then we look for a way to improve the world around us, either our own environment, our home, our family, or the greater tribe, right? Helping society at large. And so that's, I think, part of why when we take on these big challenges, we might be feeling kind of fulfilled because it's like, okay, I am now working towards improving. And that's, that is a pretty good strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I like that, and I think that as we do try to pursue whatever it is that we need to do to make our lives better, whether or not it's as hunter-gatherers, many years ago, or as it's today in a vastly different world, in essence, we're doing the same thing. We just have very, very different environments that we're trying to do it with. One other question that I was thinking that I would love to get your thoughts on are, with regards to specifically the neuroscience of it all, in terms of these chemicals, like, you both mentioned in terms of technology and the addiction, and that's obviously connected to, being able to tap into the power of dopamine. And there's very, there's not one evil, as you mentioned, there's not one evil person behind the desk going, okay, we're going to manipulate. But these organizations are optimized for attention, which is a commodity, which leads to money. Therefore, they've done whatever with AI as well. And their job is to be able to optimize your attention. And we are, to a degree, the victims of that. Now, we're not fully the victims because, to your point as well, we collaborate with that. But we don't collaborate with it a lot of times consciously. It's almost like we are unconsciously taken along because of how we're hardwired. What recommendations, and you give a number in the book, for example, you talk about the behavioral principle of stimulus control, for example. What are some of the strategies? And I know you've done tons. I love the stories in the book. I love the strategies in the book. I highly recommend it. Everybody goes in and gets it. From your perspective, what are some of the most important things that you stumbled upon as you looked? Because like Dr. Cialdini, you're big into evidence-based stuff, which I love, which is what I very much value. What are some of the most useful strategies that you found to deal with this world, not just the technology part, but the social distance that we have from people, the some of the negative impacts, civilization, the lack of closeness with our close-knit friends? What are some of the most useful evidence-based strategies you found to be helpful in handling some of these drives and handling the modern world with?
So I have two global ones. I mean, I think we could go into some sort of motive by motive, but two that sort of work across the board. And these are backed by a lot of research on behavior change, but one is, like we said, setting up your environment, right? If you want to avoid reading news stories on your phone before bed, you keep your phone out of the bedroom. The second one is seeking social support. And, Cialdini talks about a lot of different ways you can do this with sort of like commitments and things, but there's also, if you're trying to change your diet, having accountability partners, or if you're simply feeling disconnected, no matter how much you're spending time on social media, just making plans to get lunch with friends. And so those two things, and also not only just making plans, but then also telling people, like right now I'm trying to cut carbs, and I put on Twitter that every day that I don't eat carbs, I give my kids $1. And at the end of the week, if I haven't had any processed carbs, I give them $10. And that gets them to hold me accountable a little bit. It gets me to hold myself accountable, because now I feel bad. I feel worse about sort of stealing the money from my children than eating the carbs. And so those, I think, are the two big strategies, I would say.
Love it.
The other, I think we might want to spell out stimulus control a little bit more, because I think that not everybody is going to remember it from their intro psych class or whatever. But, the idea is that, well, actually, I'm not even going to go too much, but the idea of stimulus control is that we are good, we respond to, to incentives in the environment. Okay. And so if you want to control your environment, you want to be sure that you have the right incentives in front of you. Okay. And so, like the best example of this is, with regard to our tendency to overeat, there's one of the beautiful mismatches, is that our ancestors really needed calories. They, and we talk in the book about a guy named Walter Hudson who got up to 1,197 pounds or something in that vicinity, couldn't even leave his bedroom because he couldn't fit through the door. That couldn't have happened in the ancestral environment, because our ancestors were, they were eating, whatever fruits and vegetables they could find, and whatever.
Yeah, they had to search, right? I think that's one of the main things.
They were moving around, yeah.
And so to set up your environment these days, you put your food out of reach, right? Don't necessarily buy as much each time you go to the grocery store, so that if you want more, you've got to go to the grocery store again. And so yeah. The essential idea of stimulus control is you make the undesirable actions as difficult as possible, and you make the healthier alternatives as easy as possible.
What I love about that, it's very much in alignment with obviously nudging in behavioral economics and organizing your environment to make exactly what you said there. And it's like this whole thing that a lot of times, a number of years ago, people were all about willpower, and you need to have the willpower, and Baumeister's studies and stuff. And what they actually found out is actually the secret to it is not about, getting more willpower. It's making things easier for yourself.
Exactly.
And making it, and all the social behavioral changes around the world that they're doing to, get people to exercise. There's the steps in Sweden, in the middle of Stockholm, whereby
the piano steps.
The piano steps, exactly. Yes, right. And I was in Japan when I was teaching a workshop in Japan, and I went to the supermarket, and they had these steps up, or you could get the elevator, and it was a very high building, and every step had a calories. So as you walked up, you could count how many calories you were actually, thing. So yeah. It's, to me, I love that notion. Sorry, Douglas.
I was just going to add one thing to what Dave said, because Dave is actually good at doing these kinds of things. So my shirt is still sweaty. And if you look over here, you can see my bicycle. What Dave did first, and what I followed, I don't know which of us went first, but we live, far enough from campus that we need a bicycle to get here. Okay. And so we both turned in our parking stickers. We don't renew our parking stickers anymore. And so we have to bike in, because it would cost us, $15 a day to park. And so we don't want to do that. And also it's very inconvenient getting into traffic and all that. So we get on our bicycles, and we kind of don't have any choice about that. On some very hot days, I'd really like to drive in, but I'm not going to I'd rather than spend the $15, I get on my bike and I zip up here. And so, that's another, so there's two sides of it. you want to control the food. Don't put the Ben and Jerry's in your freezer in the first place. Don't put the, a 12 pack of IPAs in the beer in your refrigerator, in the first place. And at the same time, make it hard for you to get the calories, but make it easy for yourself to get the exercise, easier than the alternative. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing that Dave has pointed out to me at times is that applies not just to our eating, it also applies to things like, well, Dave was just referring to, you can control the inputs you get, from these devices by keeping them out of the room, there's actually now software you can use that will basically stop you from spending too many times on games or on the news or whatever. And so, there's a lot, and even with regard to fidelity and mating in the modern world, you can go on here and you can, find, Ashley Madison, who's encouraging you to have an affair with a total stranger. And, you can, if you're in a relationship, it's a good idea to just get those apps away, get off them. Don't even look at those potential alternatives, so that you can do stimulus control for every one of these motives.
Sure. I love that. And again, I know you've heaps of more. So I recommend everyone goes to the books. But just to bring it to a sort of a close, where I normally do this thing called a lightning round, where I just ask you questions and you just give me a one word or a couple of words or one sentence answer to them, a bunch of questions. So if that's okay with you both.
So Owen, can I just say one thing before we go to the lightning round? Because it's, again, I look behind you and I see you've got Bob Cialdini's influence book, and you've got his persuasion book on your shelf behind your head. And Dave and I, we both co-author a social psych book. And as we were biking up the other day, we were having an interesting conversation about Bob. So what Cialdini did is he went out and he decided he wanted to understand influence. So he went to these, people like, people who are in cults or people who were selling fire insurance. He tried to figure out what are the tricks that compliance professionals use. And then he connected that with the research. And I was telling Dave, what he and I did is that we went to every one of these motives and made a mistake. We screwed up in every possible way along this pyramid. And, and then we looked at the research to say, how could we have done that better?
All right. So now if we fail the lightning round, you'll know why. So,
well, listen, everybody fails it. No,
all right.
I'm kidding. So it starts out with a favorite movie. Just a favorite movie. It doesn't have to be the favorite. So say Whiplash.
Whiplash.
Great movie. And Douglas?
My favorite movie, I was just talking about with David. I don't remember. He might remember the name. There was a movie that came from Finland, and it was about this guy who led these people were attacking his village, and this guy,
the gods
led
must
them
be
away
crazy?
from the village. No, it isn't the gods must. It was in Finland, and he led them away from the village, and he had them all. They asked him to show where the village was, and see, because they had kidnapped him. And so he said, all right, we're going to have to walk along this cliff, and we all need to tie because we could fall off. And then he jumps off and pulls them all down with him, all of these marauders. It was a fabulous.
I've never seen this movie. I don't know what this movie is.
So I don't know the name of it, but I'll go.
Wow,
then I better
we'll
go.
have to find that out.
Hunger Games then. I'll say Hunger
Games. Put to Owen Googling Finland group. Mountain.
Yes.
Favorite author?
Probably Salinger is the first that pops to mind.
All right.
I know that's.
Barbara Kingsolver is the best recent book I read.
You know what? Actually, I'm going to change mine to Bill Watterson from Calvin and Hobbes.
Okay. Favorite book, David?
Oh, then we'll go with The Complete Calvin and Hobbes. So yeah, now that I'm thinking about it. So
Douglas, favorite book?
I'm hard to not be primed by seeing influence behind you, but let me say On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin.
Darwin, good stuff.
Actually, I like The Beagle better. I like The Voyage of the Beagle better.
Okay, all right. Favorite artist?
Probably, classic for me is probably Magritte, but there's some new people that I really like. I like Banksy a lot. I like, oh my gosh. I like the person who draws on nails, but I can't think of their name. They make like these 3D. Do you know what I mean? Where they like screw the things in.
I can't think of the name, but I know
they're really cool. So
yeah.
So I think I'll say Kandinsky.
Okay. Good. Musician?
Probably Weird Al.
You know?
So,
I
And
was going to
Douglas?
say Christopher Parkening, who's a classical guitarist, but actually he didn't write, he plays like classical music, and so it's not really his compositions. I really like the answer Weird Al, so I'm gonna
Hey,
agree
well,
with
listen, like,
Weird Al is a genius. You know?
no, no one would argue with you. Philosopher, favorite philosopher?
I just read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and so that comes
Yeah,
to the top of my my
yeah, yeah.
mind.
It's a world beater, all right. And David?
probably Sartre, but I'm trying to think if there's I feel like there's somebody else. I'll think that's one I'll end up thinking of an hour from now.
Of course.
So,
TV series? Any particular TV series that you swear by?
I don't watch TV, but it's interesting that I have two answers to that. One is The Crown, primed by the
Yeah.
recent events. And then the other one is Mad Men, which is like, that was the life my father lived. He was worked on
Added that.
Madison Avenue for
Wow.
Young and Rubicam and J. Walter Thompson, and he lived
Wow.
that life, you know.
Very cool.
I always really liked Freaks and Geeks, and I don't know. These days I watch YouTube tutorials all the time, so I can't think of too many shows.
Dave's always bettering himself.
YouTube University. YouTube.
Yeah,
University.
I love it. So,
If you could have a superpower, which would it be?
oh man, that's a good one.
I often have dreamed in my life about flying, so
Yeah,
I'll go with
flying works.
I'll go with flying.
I think I'm going to go with stopping time. Seems really useful.
And speaking of which, time travel, where would you go? Past or future, and when? If
Just
you could.
one. We get one shot. This is
One
like
shot.
one trip,
Yeah.
and we get to return.
Yes.
And if we change things, does it have ripple effects?
It's Back to the Future. Same
All
rule.
right, Back to the Future rules. Ooh.
I mean, if I was answering seriously, I would go back and to just, the day before I made some of the dumb decisions in my life, to be honest.
Yeah.
But that's not a fun answer,
Well, it's fun for you if you're able to change the decisions.
Right.
You know what? I'm gonna go to the future. I'm gonna do like the Back to the Future 2 style. I'll find like a book of sports winners or whatever. And
Almanac.
yeah, exactly. And then I'll bring it back here. So
Good answer. Final question for both of you. One piece of advice that you would give to the world if you could put it on a billboard.
the one I always say, in the context of the book, which I think is actually really pretty solid, is find ways to help other people fulfill their fundamental motives.
Love it.
Yeah.
And Douglas?
So I would say, before starting this book, when, Dave's brother was 10 years old, I asked a bunch of my colleagues, including, one guy who won a Pulitzer Prize and a number of famous biologists and very successful people who lived lives that I regarded as, exemplary lives. What's the best advice you'd give me for a 10-year-old, kid? And what I found interesting is that time and again, people just had the simple advice: be nice to other people, and Mark Schaller, my colleague at UBC, he explained further and said that, in some sense it sounds unselfish, but it is actually in the long run selfish, because if you're nice to other people, they'll like you, they'll want to be around you, and you'll have a stronger network. So ultimately it's the most selfish thing you can do, is to be unselfish.
Love it. And on that note, thank you so much, gentlemen. Fantastic book that you've written. For anyone interested in getting it, is it just go to Amazon? Is there a website that you want to direct people to for solving modern problems with a Stone Age brain? That's the book.
So you can we have like a landing page that's solvingmodernproblems.com. You can go there and it'll show you can get the book at Amazon. You can get it at APA as our publisher. It should be kind of wherever books are sold. So if you like brick and mortar stores, then go and ask. And if they don't have it, then demand.
So on that website, just one other thing, we are about to put up a worksheet. So at the end of the book, what Dave and I did is we went through and looked at the advice we had given in all these chapters, and we decided to make a to-do list for ourselves for tomorrow. Each one of us made it separate. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to the supermarket and buy blueberries and kale, and I'm going to say hello to it.
That's
and
right.
So we had a worksheet for ourselves. And so we've decided to make one up for other people and just put it on this website so that anybody can
Yes.
download it, and it can say, here's some things you can do in each of these categories tomorrow.
Brilliant. What's the website again? One more time.
It's just solvingmodernproblems.com, like the first half of the book. So
Perfect. Solvingmodernproblems.com. Douglas, David, thank you so much. A real honor to talk to you. And I hope you will be kind enough to come back on the podcast again in the future, because I've loved talking to you, and best of luck with everything.
that would be wonderful. This was fantastic. Also, when we come back, I want to find out your answers to your questions.
No problem. No problem.
All right.
Mine are way worse than yours, by the way.
Hey, wait, you're saying ours were bad?
Next time I'll have thought of a better
philosopher.
philosopher.
Right answer.
Thanks so much again, guys.
All right. Thank you.